Welcome to Regent Park TV. I'm Gabriel, and today we are exploring the Refugee Experience, an issue close to Regent Park, a neighborhood that has long welcomed newcomers. On Monday, March 3rd, Romero House, a community that welcomes and supports refugee claimants in Toronto, hosted the annual Howcroft Lecture at St. Martin-in-the-Fields Church. This year's talk, Dignity in Crisis, the Complexity of the Refugee Experience, was delivered by Dr. James Orbinski, a renowned physician, humanitarian, and former president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Dr. Orbinski has worked on the front lines of global crises, providing medical care in war zones and refugee camps. His efforts have shaped humanitarian aid policies and advanced refugee rights, making him a leading advocate for displaced communities. In 1999, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of Médecins Sans Frontières for its life-saving work. Over the decades, he has aided refugees in conflict zones from Rwanda to Somalia. Dr. Orbinski's lecture was especially relevant to Regent Park, a neighborhood shaped by migration, where many refugees begin their new lives in Canada. He emphasized that their struggle doesn't end upon arrival. They must navigate complex systems, heal from trauma, and find a sense of belonging. It shed light on the resilience of those navigating these challenges. Stay tuned as we explore these issues further. In this segment, Dr. Orbinski questions why we should care about refugees, highlighting the tough choices they make to flee danger and seek safety. He points out that there are currently 123 million displaced people worldwide, the highest number since World War II. Dr. Orbinski stresses that despite arriving penniless and facing challenges, refugees in Canada contribute greatly to society. Now let's listen as Dr. Orbinski dives deeper into these crucial points.
Today there's now 123 million people around the world who are either internally displaced or who are refugees. That's the highest number since the end of World War II. And that number is increasing steadily every single year. And it is increasing very much in relation, to the changing geopolitical context in which we find ourselves. Now, here in Canadian society, we've often asked, why should we care? And why should we support refugees or those who seek refuge? Well, in the last 45 years, Canada has accepted about 1,100,000 people who are formally refugees. And most of those people, in fact, the vast majority of that 1,100,000 have made and continue to make enormous contributions to Canadian society. Despite the fact that when they arrived here in Canada, more than 95% of them had $0 in their pocket. They were absolutely penniless when they arrived here in Canada. And despite the fact that most people had to learn a new language, also had to learn a new culture, also had to care for their own children and their own spouses, and had to face that enormous challenge of being alone among what they would certainly hope would be friends. That 1,100,000 people over the course of the last 45 years have done extraordinary things themselves. The vast majority have embraced opportunity for a better life, making huge contributions, not only to our economy, but also to our cultural diversity, to our way of seeing ourselves, and to our way of seeing ourselves in the world. We also know that when you look at just some very hard statistics and comparing that particular group of people to Canadian-born people, we know that the unemployment rate for refugees in Canada is about 9% in the first 5 to 10 years that they are newly arrived in Canada. By 10 years, it goes down from 9% to 6%, which in fact is the average unemployment rate for Canadian-born people. We also know that in the first year that people arrive in Canada as refugees, the average income is around 20,000 US dollars. And remember the challenges that people who are in that circumstance are facing. Learning a new language, learning a new culture, having to make friends when they don't necessarily speak fluently the language of parlance, and having to also care for their own children and their own families. Within the next 5 years, the majority of people who are refugees achieve a middle-class income at par with the income of Canadian-born citizens. Within, about 23% of refugees within 5 years become earners of around $40,000 to $80,000 a year, which is at par with about 27% of Canadians. So 23% of refugees earn that amount of income, which is pretty much or pretty close to the 27% of Canadians who also earn that amount of income. And let's remember that anyone who is earning an income is also paying taxes. So within a very, very short period of time, the average refugee or person who was a refugee on arrival is at par, essentially, with Canadian-born citizens. There are differences. Skill levels. Within the refugee group, about 51%, or half or slightly more, have either completed or do complete a high school education or complete high skill level education, whether that's high school, college, university, or graduate studies or postgraduate studies. And about 16% of that group are actually what are categorized as highly skilled people. People who are doctors, lawyers, architects, managers, and so on. And so in a very short period of time, people who are refugees on arrival become essentially at par with Canadian-born people. 14% become entrepreneurs or start their own businesses, and that compares to 12% of people of a similar, Canadian-born people of a similar age. We also know that home ownership, and this is a bit of a difference, but not much of a difference. 65% of refugees become home owners within 10 years of their arrival here in Canada. And that compares, by age cohort, that compares to about 79% of Canadians of a similar age and economic status. So there is a difference there. And that difference is largely accounted for by transfer of generational wealth that they do not obviously have privy to. And so the idea that somehow refugees or people who are seeking refuge are by definition a perpetual burden on the society that has welcomed them is just simply not true. In fact, the opposite is true. They make enormous contributions to the country, enormous contributions to culture, and enormous contributions to how we come to see ourselves, and how we then, therefore, can or might come to see ourselves as a people and as a nation in the world of people and in the community of nations. Well, here we are now in the year 2025, and development is a target. Aid is a target. The political culture globally has fundamentally shifted. Now what we formerly saw as victims, what we formerly saw as people suffering unjustly, what we formerly rooted our response to based on the common dignity of all of us, that very idea has been turned on its head so that those people are now a threat to us. Those people are parasites on us. Those people and that system is a system that bleeds the wealth and prosperity of us away from our own needs, our own community needs, and is a fraud, right? To use Donald Trump's word in describing the international system. Today we have 123 million people who are internally displaced or who are refugees. With this shift, not only around the systems of development assistance and humanitarian assistance, but also, more importantly, the shift in the perspective, a security-oriented perspective, and also a shift in the way that what were previously victims are now problems that we must protect ourselves against. This will mean that there will be even more internally displaced people, more than 123 million, and that the rate of increase, while it has been increasing significantly, the slope of that increase is just only going to go up in the coming years. So we will see more internally displaced persons. We will see more people who are seeking refuge across their own borders and into the lands of others.
In this next segment, Dr. Orbinski challenges the notion that we only value refugees when their stories make us feel good or reinforce our narratives of being a kind and welcoming nation. He points out that while Canada has seen a 70% increase in refugees over the past few years, we must be ready to take in even more. Dr. Orbinski also highlights the reality that not all refugees fit the feel-good story, and some may not align with our idealized image of who a refugee should be.
Sometimes we're very good at telling ourselves that we're good. Sometimes we're very good at looking for evidence that we're good. And that sometimes means that we treat people who are seeking refuge as only important to the extent that they make me feel good, or that they reinforce my own story, my own narrative, my own sense of being a good person or being a good nation. Now, I don't want to knock Canada or our culture too much, but I will, and in that regard, I will say that over the last 5 years, we have seen a steady increase in the number of people who are allowed to declare refugee status or who are recognized as refugees in Canada. From 2020, it was about 110,000 people that were refugees in 2020. Well, 2021, it was 130,000, in 2022, 140,000, and in 2023, 170,000. So that's a 70% increase in the number of people who are refugees here in Canada. And I think that's good. But I also think that we must be prepared in our changing world to take many, many more people who are refugees. There are particular circumstances in Canada that shield us from the actual living experience of encountering people who are seeking refuge. Our geography, our third-party agreement with the United States, for example, our downloading of refugee clearance to get on an aircraft to the airlines around the world that are attempting to fly into Canada. There are a number of things that we do that shield us. And one of them that I'd just like to mention is the program that allows for groups like this particular church or small groups within this church to sponsor a refugee and to, as a group, support that person or that person's family. Well, that program now is on hold, and that is a real, in my mind, it's a real shame on us as a country. Not all refugees or people who come to us or come to our doorstep or our threshold come with a good or a feel-good story, or a story that'll make me feel good and make me pat myself on the back as a good Canadian, a good Christian, a good person. Wow, aren't we just a great community that we can do this, and we want to do this, and for us it's just natural. Well, that's an easy thing to say when the average refugee fits the criteria or fits the statistics that I began with. That within a very short time, within 5 years, the vast majority, 95% of people who come as refugees are virtually part of the economy, of the culture. They're taxpayers, they're entrepreneurs, they're homeowners, and they're, guess what, more proud to be a Canadian than Canadian-born Canadians. So the idea that somehow refugees make us feel good, yeah, that's kind of true, in the majority of cases. And with that group, that 95%, that just validates just how great we are. But not all refugees come with a feel-good story. Not all refugees come with a desire to make you feel good about yourself.
Next, Dr. Orbinski shared the personal story of Jacques Vermeuren, a refugee from Rwanda, central to this discussion, highlighting that not all refugee experiences fit the feel-good narrative. Jacques, who came to Canada as a 19-year-old, carried with him the deep scars of violence and trauma that often come with displacement, a reality that many refugees face. His journey wasn't just about escaping danger, but also about navigating the emotional and psychological toll of starting over in a new country. Jacques was a beloved member of the Romero House community, and his sudden passing in 2023 left a lasting impact. And now, let's return to Dr. Orbinski's lecture.
I'm just going to tell you very briefly about Jacques, a friend of ours. And I hope in the telling, we will realize how important the commitment of Romero House is, how important the actions and the prayers, but frankly, more important, the actions that the Romero House community brings to bear for people who are refugees. I hazard to say that most of the people who are at Romero House as refugees are actually in that big category that I talked about. With a little care, a little support, they'll be okay. Right? They just need encouragement. They need a short period where a little bit of support will go a very long way. But there are people at Romero, and there are people in Regent Park, at the Regent Park Community Center and shelter. There are people at shelters across the city who are refugees and who don't fit that nice story that I just told you about the majority of refugees. I met Jacques during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. He was 4 years old. He and his mother and his sister were living in a broom closet outside my room. And they were living with about 8,000 other people who had fled to the hospital grounds, because of the genocide and the killings that were going on across the country. And about 1 million people, some people say it's 800,000, but others say it's higher, but the number is, that's not the debate. 1 million people were killed by machete largely in less than 100 days across Rwanda over the course of the genocide. And Kigali, which is the capital city of Rwanda, was the epicenter of not only the killing, but also of the political and of the military battle to control the country. And it was a battle between the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Major Kagame, Paul Kagame, and the RGF, the Rwandan government forces, led by, frankly, a deeply, deeply corrupt entity within the Rwandan government called the Kuza. Jacques, at 4, was brought by his mom, who carried his sister on her back, from one part of the city, Kemiarora it's called, to the King Faisal Hospital. And she came in the night with her son and her daughter. Her daughter was 2, Vanessa. And she came with hundreds of others on that particular night, and the total was in the thousands by the time they had arrived. And people were sleeping under stairwells, sleeping in hallways, sleeping in broom closets, sleeping in the inner quad of the hospital. But nobody was sleeping outside the periphery of the hospital. There was a fence around the hospital. And outside that fence were snipers, were killing squads. And in fact, in many cases, killing squads actually came into the hospital grounds at nighttime and would call, as they called it, people. There were wild dogs that were literally fat with the taste of human flesh, running in wild packs around the hospital. Nobody would sleep outside the walled perimeter of the hospital. And Jacques' mother, Sylvie Mukarushima, she was a very intrepid and smart and engaged person. She never missed an opportunity, never missed an initiative. She figured out how to get the key to the closet outside my room. And that's where I met Sylvie Mukurushima, Jacques, and his sister, Vanessa. At one point over the following weeks, I treated his sister for pneumonia, and I would often watch Sylvie wash the kids, the 2 kids, in a small little red basin, plastic basin, on the floor outside the broom closet. Now, Jacques was a mixie. He was half white and half Hutu. His father was a French expatriate who had abandoned Sylvie and his son, and in fact wouldn't admit that he in fact had a son. Because Jacques was a mixie, and because of the politics of the French, of the RGF, and of the Tutsis, I won't go into it in any great detail, but it was complex, and Jacques embodied that conflict by being half white in French and by being half Hutu. In the hospital, he was beaten up every single day by the other kids because of what he was, not who he was, but because of what he was. And over the course of time, I started asking him to come with me during the day while I would go to the pediatric ward or go into the operating room or go and do whatever it is that I was doing, except when I would leave the hospital. And so during the day, when I would do hospital rounds, he would walk behind me and he would carry my stethoscope. And just a little guy, and he was very proud of himself, and he would give me the stethoscope. And he very soon learned the rhythm of the doctor-patient interaction. Right? You say hello, there's a few exchanges, you ask a few questions, and then you say, well, I'm just going to listen to your chest or listen to your tummy. Right? That's the kind of sequence. So Jacques would stand there very dutifully holding my stethoscope, and he would watch the rhythm unfold, and when it got to the right time, he would just lift up my stethoscope, right? And I would use it, and then I would return it to him. When I would leave the hospital, which was often, more than 2 or 3 times a day, I would leave the hospital. Those are the toughest times for Jacques, because it meant that the other boys would come and find him, and they would beat him, and they would beat him, and sometimes very, very harshly. But to fast forward, the genocide ended, I left the country, but my wife and I stayed in touch with Sylvie and Jacques and Vanessa. And we helped them as best we could under various circumstances. And I would go to Rwanda several times over the ensuing years. And every time, either when I was traveling alone or I was traveling with my wife, we would always find Sylvie and Jacques and Vanessa. Now, every single time we went back, they were in a different city. They were in a different location. Now, why? Because as Jacques grew, and as the politics around the French government and the now RPF Rwandan government, around who shot down the plane of the RGF, or the Rwandan government, in April of 1994. Many thought that it was the French government. The French government was accusing the RPF of having done it to catalyze their invasion from Uganda to defend the Tutsi people, and so on. So in the context of that political battle between the French government and the Rwandan government, being a Mixi was deeply, deeply politicized. Now, Jacques, as he grew from this, and as people will remember, he was about that, as he grew from this to that, he was more and more targeted, more and more brutalized, not only by other kids, but by teachers, by some of the healthcare professionals that he interacted with, just seeking normal medical care. And Mixis like him were overtly targeted by various political parties within Rwanda. And so his mom had no choice but to move. She became, in effect, an internally displaced person with her children, moving from a known danger to her son, a danger that was becoming increasingly brutal and increasingly life-threatening with every single attack that happened. She left, she had no choice but to leave here for there. Eventually, Jacques made his way to Canada, and he came to live with myself and my wife and our 3 children. And we got him a lawyer, of course, and he was acknowledged as a refugee, and he achieved refugee status. He lived with us for about 1.5 years, just under 1.5 years. And during the first few months of that it was great. He was French speaking and also Kinyarwanda speaking. And so we got him into an English language course, got him a part-time job at Massey College, helping with the maintenance and so on and so on. And he was very, very happy at first. But the memories, the uncertainty about his own family, about his mother, his sister, he also had two brothers who were much older. The uncertainty about his own family, it was all just too much for him. He started smoking marijuana increasingly, and I had 3 young children, and he was at first incredibly polite, incredibly just a wonderful, warm, kind, loving young man. We have pictures and videos of him feeding my daughter, who was just a toddler at the time, of him sitting with my boys on his lap, trying to read to them in French and teach them French, of playing hockey for the first time. We took him out to Winnipeg to see Rolly, my wife's parents, and it was the first time that he had seen such incredible snow. And he was just full of delight and glee at the experience. But as he smoked more and more dope, he sometimes came to dinner and he was stoned, and it just got worse and worse. And my children said, "Daddy, what's wrong with Jacques? Why does he keep looking at the ceiling?" You know? And over some time, I said to him, "Jacques, this has to stop. You cannot be doing this in this house." "Oh, yes, no, promise. I promise. I will never do it again." You know? And then a few weeks later, same, and then it would just escalate again. And at a certain point, he was stoned a lot. And I was, as a father of 3 young children, I was very, very concerned, and so was my wife. And so I called Mary Jo. And I asked Mary Jo, I explained the situation, and she said, "Yes, I know this happens. It's not going to be easy, but we'll do our best. So send him over." So we went over, and Mary Jo very graciously and very kindly took Jacques into the house, into Romero House, without judgment, but also with clarity about what was expected in the community. And the staff were wonderful. And like many, they fell in love with Jacques. He was fantastic. He had a smile that could light up a room. Just the most incredible kid. Things didn't work out at Romero. He was again smoking more and more dope, was engaged in some criminal activities. We then organized for him to move in with a friend of mine, Leo Kabalesa, a Rwandan, who said, "No, I know what he needs. He needs a Rwandan man. You don't understand, much as you would like to. He needs a Rwandan man. He needs a Rwandan father." And Leo was wonderful in every possible way. And yet 6 months later, it was the same story. And Leo had a daughter who was then 16, Mutini, and he just couldn't, as a father to his daughter, he could not allow this to continue. And so we got Jacques, Leo and myself, we got him a room in a boarding house. And Jacques was coming to my house every week from the time that he had left our house to Romero and then to Leo's and then to the boarding house. He was coming to our house every week for dinner on Monday night. And he wasn't stoked. He knew. And but there were 2 weeks where he didn't show up. So I called Leo, I called Romero, Have you seen Jacques? Have you heard from Jacques? And there were many people at Romero and beyond at Massey and elsewhere who were deeply involved in his life. I called many of them, and nobody had seen him. So Leo and I went to his rooming house, and I actually broke down the door, I'll tell you that in all honesty. The landlord wasn't going to let me in, so I just broke down the door. And there was Jacques, standing on a milk crate, naked, with all kinds of religious symbols and words scrawled all over the walls. Bean cans, tuna cans, cigarette butts, roaches, everywhere. And it's a wonder that he didn't burn down the house, because in the bed there were all kinds of cigarette butts and everything else. And it was very obvious to me that he was catatonic, and that he was having a catatonic schizophrenic episode. So I brought him down to CAMH, and he was admitted, and I'll skip the rest of the story. But what I'll tell you is that he was in and out of CAMH for some 14 years. And I was his medical substitute decision maker. And I don't know how many times I was down at CAMH, meeting with psychiatrists, meeting with Jacques. I don't know how many letters I wrote to judges asking for leniency, for the crime that he very almost clearly and certainly had committed. He was now into crack and then into harder drugs. And despite the efforts of so many at Romero, Leo, people at Massey, other people who I don't want to name, despite the efforts of many people, Jacques' demons were just too powerful. The memories of what he had lived and what he struggled with on a daily basis were just too much. And 2 years ago, he was found dead in an alleyway in downtown Toronto. And he had died of a massive drug overdose. And he was the person who finally went and bent down on their knee to see if he was all right. Was a doctor, actually. He'd been there almost 12 hours, dead, with all of the passers-by just going along. Oh, another homeless person. And only one, within 12 hours, stopped. Now, Jacques, I also want to say this. This is very important. However difficult it was made easier. By the care and the respect that the coroner and the police in this city gave him and gave me. He, as a person who had died very visibly as a drug addict on the street, the police, the coroner, the forensic team that looked at him, they were so kind and they were so respectful. And I would just say that they're the ones that pick up where the rest of society has failed. And it really struck me just how much they cared and how much they tried in every specific way to honor him, to honor his dignity, Now, for all of us, a person like Jacques is not a feel-good story. It doesn't tell us how good we are. But it does tell us that we tried. And we genuinely tried.
In this last segment, Dr. Orbinski reflects on the deep challenges we face globally and the role of unconditional love in responding to these difficulties. He discusses how, in the face of political failures, it's through our actions towards the most vulnerable that we can truly understand the meaning of love and compassion.
Love is an action, even in the face of imperfection, even in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of trying to help a person who you know is truly, truly struggling, and who you know is not going to give you that feel-good story where I can say, well, I'm a good person, I'm a good Christian, I'm a good community. But it's to that place, in the face of political failure, and we are now in a moment where we are moving very quickly to more profound political failure internationally. It's in that moment where we find our true selves and where we find the true experience, never mind the meaning. The meanings are intellectual. Where we find the experience of unconditional love. And that is what the Romero House is to me, and what has always been, as long as I've known it. As long as I've known Mary Jo, as long as I've known Jack Costello, that has always been its essence. And I will say in closing, that how we choose to see the most vulnerable among us, how we choose to be in relation to the most vulnerable among us, it's that place where we could truly discover the meaning of the word love, and truly discover through our action what it means to be genuinely compassionate toward the suffering of another human being. I do want to just also say that in the Vedantic philosophy, or the philosophy that gave rise to Hinduism, to Buddhism, Jainism, and so on, there's a very clear instruction that one must practice one's faith, and practice those activities that help you improve your understanding of the great mystery, as they call it, and what we call God. But that this is not independent of what we must do with our understanding, and that we cannot wait for some perfect understanding. The understanding comes more readily through what we do. We discover love, we discover God through our actions toward others, and most significantly toward those who are the most vulnerable among us.
In a time of rising hostility towards migrants, Dr. Orbinski's message is clear. Welcoming refugees is both a moral duty and an enrichment to communities like Regent Park. Organizations like the Romero House embody this by offering not just shelter, but dignity and hope. The lecture reminds us that communities play a vital role in helping refugees heal and belong. As rhetoric around migration grows more suspicious, we must prioritize integration, acceptance, and support over fear. I'm Gabriel Meissner. Thanks for watching RPTV. Until next time.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit us on all our social media platforms. Please visit our website for more information.